So this week we're going to be talking about study startup and specifically the role of the CRA in the startup process and some of the tasks that you might be asked to participate in. My name is Steve Pope, and for our purpose, the study startup process includes the activities that must occur before a site is eligible to begin screening and enrolling subjects in a clinical trial. Now, these activities include, but they're not necessarily limited to, the following items. For example, collecting essential documents before the study starts, conducting investigator meetings, signing contracts and budgets, shipping material or trial materials to sites, and then conducting site initiation visits. So I'm going to go over each of those items as we move along, but these are some of the things that are associated with the study startup process. Our learning objectives for the week will be to discuss study startup activities, to discuss the role of the monitor in study startup, to cite the regulatory documents collected during study startup, and to describe the successful startup process. So before we get into the study startup process, let's take a moment and talk about some of the key functional areas of the clinical research enterprise. These would be functional areas that make up, say, a contract research organization or even a pharma company would have these functional areas. And this is kind of how the businesses are organized into specific areas. So let's talk about each one of them. First of all, you have clinical operations. That's going to include some of your in-house CRAs. Certainly your monitors are going to be involved in clinical operations, but anything associated with conducting the trial and communicating with sites and things like that. You're also going to have regulatory and legal. Sometimes these might be separated, or the regulatory function could actually roll up under clinical operations, depending on how it's organized. But those are going to be functional areas that have a role in the startup process. Then you have data management. Data management has a specific role in the startup process, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the things that they're involved in during this stage. And then finally, safety. So safety is going to be assessing adverse events, serious adverse events, and be involved in the medical safety of the subjects that we're going to enroll in our trial. So let's begin our discussion of study startup by first looking at the different stages of a clinical trial. And I like to use that word stages because I don't want to use phases, because that pertains to something entirely different. That's a regulatory term that I don't want to be confusing you guys with that. So the different stages that we have are going to be the startup stage, the conduct stage, and then finally the closeout stage. So you could think of these as in terms of the different activities on a timeline from beginning to end, from the startup portion to the end of when we're closing out our trial. I'm going to use this table to break down the activities of the various stages of a clinical trial. So if you notice along the top of the first row, we have the different stages that I mentioned earlier: startup, conduct, and closeout. And then along or in the first column, we have broken out those functional areas: clinical operations, regulatory/legal, data management, and then finally safety. So if we look at the startup stage of our trial, in the clinical operations, regulatory/legal functional areas, we're involved in identifying sites that we're going to use in the trial, sending out contracts, sending out confidential disclosure agreements. We're going to start collecting some of the essential documents that we need from each site. These are going to be site level documents such as our FDA Form 1572, staff CVs, medical licenses of investigators, GCP certificates, and financial disclosure forms. We're also going to be performing pre-study site visits. We talked about that briefly in our last week. In addition, we're going to collect IRB approvals. Those are going to be approvals for the site, for the principal investigator. That's going to include an approval for the protocol and for the informed consent document, and then any trial materials that we might be using. So anything that's going to be handed to a subject needs to be approved by the IRB. We're going to conduct an investigator meeting. We'll talk about that in a little more detail as we go along. And then we're finally going to be conducting site initiation visits where we're going to go out to the site and make sure they have everything that they need and essentially get them started to begin screening and enrolling subjects. On the data management side, they're going to be involved in some activities as well. As we're doing all these things, they're going to be setting up the clinical database. They're going to create case report forms. They're going to create the edit checks that are going to be used to work with our clinical database to clean the data as it starts being entered. And then they're going to finally test and validate the database to make sure everything's working correctly. For our safety team, they're going to also set up a safety database, which is going to be very similar to the clinical database, but it's going to contain the safety data. They're primarily concerned with serious adverse events, so they're responsible for assessing these serious adverse events, collecting the information for those, basically monitoring the subject safety who are enrolled in our study. And then they're going to be involved in IND safety letters. If we have any that need to go out, they handle that and make sure those are out and available for all of our investigators. So once we complete the startup phase, then we're going to move into the conduct stage, and there's some specific tasks associated with that. In the clinical operations / regulatory legal area, we're going to be involved in seeing that sites are enrolling subjects and screening the number of subjects that they need to meet the enrollment requirements. We're going to conduct interim monitoring visits. We're going to review ICS for each subject. We'll do source data review, assess adverse events, do IP accountability. We'll also start to assess the site's performance. Are they doing the things they need to do in order to meet their contractual requirements? Things like enrollment. If they're contracted to enroll 10 subjects, how are they doing? Are they going to meet their goal of achieving that? We're going to document any protocol deviations that they may have been involved in. We're going to assess their GCP compliance. And we're also going to start to identify some protocol gaps, because what's going to happen, we're going to identify things that are later going to be requiring protocol amendments. So some changes to the protocol, if you will. On the data management team, they're going to be reviewing and cleaning data. They're going to be performing interim analysis, and they're going to conduct some soft locks so that they can take a look at the data and see if it's meeting the necessary requirements that we're going to need later on. They're also going to identify and assess data trends. And then finally, our safety team is going to be involved in assessing serious adverse events, writing IND safety letters, things like that. So on the closeout stage, our clinical operations team is going to be confirming that all site functions are complete. We're going to confirm that all the vendor equipment has been returned. We're going to discuss with the principal investigator their ongoing obligations. Post-study, these would be things like record retention obligations, what our publication policy is, then any ongoing safety issues that they need to continue to track. We discuss those items with them during the closeout visit. Our data management team is going to be involved in locking the clinical database, and then they'll start performing their statistical analysis. And then finally, the safety team is going to continue to assess subject safety, write any IND safety letters that may need to go out, and so all of these things are going to occur during the closeout stage. Getting back to the startup stage, one of the chief tasks that we're going to be doing is collecting essential documents. So essential documents are regulatory documents that are required of sites before and during a clinical trial. So some of the documents that we'll review this week include a few of the following. We're going to take a look at FDA Form 1572, a very important document. Principal Investigators Curriculum Vitae, or CV. We'll also include the staff CVs in that process as well. The Investigator Brochure signature page. We want to make sure that the PI has received the Investigator Brochure and that they've indicating that they've read and understand it. We're also going to collect Institutional Review Board approval letters. We're going to get the approved IRB approved informed consent form. We're also going to collect financial disclosure forms for all of the staff members that are listed on the 1572. We're going to collect principal investigator medical licenses and any other medical licenses for other sub-investigators. If they're going to be performing medical assessments, they need to have an active and current medical license. And then we're going to collect some lab certificates, both CLIA, CAP. These are common certificates that we'll collect for the laboratories that we're going to use. And then we're also going to collect the lab ranges. So these are just a few of the items that we're going to collect during the startup phase. That's going to be part of the regulatory pack that we're going to assess and help us determine the initiation status of our sites. The first form that we want to talk about, or the first document, is going to be the FDA Form 1572. This is known as the Statement of Investigator. So FDA form is discussed in 21 CFR 312, which is the FDA regulation associated with IND trials. It's a contract between the principal investigator and the FDA, which is going to list the facility addresses, names of sub-investigators, the IRB that's going to be used, any laboratories that are going to be used. And it's important to understand that this is a contract between the principal investigator, which is an individual, and the FDA. It's not a contract between the site and the sponsor. So very important to understand that. So by signing and dating the form with a handwritten signature and date, the PI agrees to conduct the study according to the commitments listed in Section 9 of the form. You'll have a copy of this form in your pack for this week to go over. So please take a look at Section 9 so that you are familiar with that. The important thing is that in almost every case, you're going to see handwritten signatures and dates. Now, there is a stipulation that you can use electronic signatures as long as they're validated by the sponsor and they're compliant with 21 CFR Part 11. But in the majority of cases, you're going to see handwritten signatures and handwritten dates. Very important. Let's take a look at the principal investigator's CV. So a couple of things we want to be aware of here. We want to make sure that it is signed and dated by the PI within the past 2 years. That helps us determine how current the information is on that CV. The CV should also show that the PI is affiliated with the site. So if the PI is a faculty member at a medical center and they have a site that has a different name, we want to see that they are affiliated with that site as an employee, or we have some sort of affiliation should appear on that CV. It should show what their medical education is, where they went to medical school, where they did their undergraduate work, all of those things. It should also indicate their current good clinical practice training, when that occurred, where they did it, what organization they did it with. So those things should be on our CV for the principal investigator, and that is true of any of the CVs that we're reviewing for site staff as well. The Investigator Brochure signature page, also known as the acknowledgement of receipt. This is going to be signed and dated by the principal investigator, indicating that they have received, read, and understood the Investigator Brochure. This should be a handwritten signature, handwritten date. Every once in a while during our trial, we may have an update to the Investigator Brochure. If that occurs, then we need to get a new acknowledgement of receipt or signature page from our PI, indicating that they have read and understood the updated Investigator's Brochure. The IRB documents that we're going to collect will include our IRB approval letter, also the IRB approved informed consent form, the letter from the IRB stating that the study has been approved. It'll also indicate the study, the principal investigator, the investigator's brochure, etc., and what is required of the PI for continued approval. The letter must show the date of approval and should be signed by the approving individual at the IRB. The IRB approved informed consent form should state the name of the IRB and the approval date. Financial disclosure form. This is an FDA requirement, so anyone participating in an FDA regulated trial, anyone that's listed on the 1572 should be completing a financial disclosure form. So this must indicate, the financial disclosure form will indicate whether or not the individual holds a financial interest in the sponsor company in accordance with 21 CFR Part 54. So it's important to understand that they have to indicate whether or not they hold a financial interest. If they hold a financial interest, it does not prevent them from participating in a clinical trial. However, they just need to disclose that to the FDA. Now, the FDA may have some issue with the disclosure, but initially it doesn't prevent them from participating. We want to review the principal investigator's medical license. So the PI must hold a current state-issued medical license in the United States to conduct a study. The same requirement holds for sub-investigators participating in the study if they are performing assessments that require a licensed practitioner. So what this would mean, any sub-investigators that might be MDs or DOs, we want to collect their medical licenses. We may have sub-investigators that are RNs or nurse practitioners or physician's assistants. We also want to collect their licenses as well, and we want to make sure that they're current. So this would be the definition that I've used here is specifically for U.S.-based sites. If they were a PI in another country, then they need to hold whatever current licensing requirements in that country or in that jurisdiction would be applicable. We're going to collect laboratory documents. These are most commonly referred to as CLIA and CAP certificates, and also their lab ranges. So clinical laboratories must be certified by either Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments or the College of American Pathologists, and laboratories will provide normal ranges for the laboratory tests conducted for the study. So those 2 or 3 documents. Sometimes the CLIA may be all that we're required to collect. Some studies or sponsors might want to have both the CLIA and the CAP certificate collected, but we certainly want to collect the lab ranges, and a lot of times you can find those on the laboratory website. They'll usually publish that as well as the certificates as well. So these are going to have expiration dates. So when they expire, or when you're getting close to the expiration date, you need to pull off the new one and make sure the site has that stored in their investigator site file. The sponsor is going to conduct investigator meetings. In most cases, they'll have a meeting. There could be instances where you work on a trial where there is no investigator meeting, but these are going to be held during the startup stage by the sponsor, and they're designed to convene all of the investigators, usually a representative of the site staff, any vendors that you're using, and you've got your sponsor reps there. So they'll convene them all in one location, or they might have more than one location depending on how large it is. And they're going to discuss study training. They're going to get oriented on the trial. There'll be some general knowledge about the trial, basically everything they need to be trained on in order for them to start conducting the trial. These are going to be attended. The investigator meeting may satisfy the site initiation visit requirements. So some sponsors may decide if an investigator and a coordinator attend the investigator meeting, then that site does not have to have a site initiation visit, that the meeting itself serves as that initiation visit. The sites and the sponsor are going to sign contracts and budgets. So each site must have a signed contract to conduct the trial and a payment budget before they're activated to begin screening and enrollment. Ordinarily, your finance and your legal teams will be involved in this, so CRAs probably don't have a lot to do with this process, but I do want to make sure that you're aware that this would be done during the startup stage and then prior to a site being activated. We're going to ship all the trial materials to the sites. So sites must receive all of their trial materials, supplies, and investigational product before they can begin screening and enrollment. So ideally, these should be received by the site prior to the site initiation visit, but many times you'll be conducting site initiation visits where the site hasn't received all of these items. That's pretty common, but they do have to have all of these things on board and in place before they can start the screening and enrolling process. CRAs or monitors are going to be conducting site initiation visits. So these are visits that provide training and orientation to the study for site staff and are conducted by the CRA, or they might be conducted by a sponsor monitor, or they may have both. And as I mentioned before, sometimes attending the investigator meeting may satisfy this requirement. Here are your reading assignments for this week in the CRA's Guide to Monitoring Clinical Research. We're going to read Chapter 8, which discusses institutional review boards and data safety monitoring boards. We're also going to take a look at Chapter 13, which is the study initiation content of our textbook. And then finally, using ICH E6 R2, we want to review Section 8, which is a listing of all the essential documents that we're going to collect during, and after our clinical trial. So that begins on page 46 of that PDF that is loaded out there on Moodle. Probably a good idea to go ahead and download that to your PC so that you have it, because we're going to be using that document throughout our course. And then finally, for your online assignment, what I'd like for you to do is to review the following documents that are found in the topic section on Moodle. There's a folder in there with the essential documents that we're going to be taking a look at this week. And I want you to determine if they meet the compliance requirements that we've discussed in this lecture presentation. So you'll see on there all the documents that we've been talking about, the 1572, the CVs, medical licenses, etc. I've gone over each of these, and so you should have an idea of what to look for to ensure that those documents meet the compliance standards. So review those. I think for some of you, these are going to be familiar. For those of you that already work in the industry, you're going to know what financial disclosure form looks like, or 1572. But post your assessment in this week's discussion forum. So do let me know if you have any questions about this, and I'll see you on the discussion forum this week.